The trouble started long before anyone realized it would turn into a neighborhood story people would whisper about for years. It began quietly, like most problems do, with small moments that didn't look like much on the surface. The owner of the house at the end of the road had lived there for a long time. He was the kind of person who kept to himself, kept his property clean, and didn't bother anyone. The house sat slightly apart from the rest of the neighborhood, on a wider piece of land with a long driveway that curved away from the main road because the driveway was wide and easy to turn around in. People had gotten used to using it like a public space. Delivery vans, teenagers learning to drive, and even guests from other streets used it to make quick turns when they missed their own entrances. At first, the owner didn't think much of it. But after years of random cars showing up at all hours, headlights flashing into his windows late at night, and tire marks appearing along the edges of the pavement, he had finally decided he needed to solve the problem. He didn't want to cause trouble for anyone. He didn't want to fight with drivers or stand outside telling people to turn around somewhere else. He simply wanted privacy and peace on his own land. So he came up with a simple solution: 2 huge concrete planters at the front of the driveway. These weren't normal planters from a garden center. They were industrial, solid, the kind used for public buildings or parks to stop vehicles from going into restricted areas. Each one weighed for tons and had a simple, natural look that fit in with the plants and trees around the driveway. He placed them carefully, leaving enough space for himself to enter, but blocking the wide, easy turn that everyone else relied on. Once they were in place, the flow of cars stopped. The driveway was quiet again. He could finally sit on his porch without hearing engines rumbling every few minutes. For a while, everything went smoothly. Then the new HOA board member moved in. She arrived with a reputation that spread faster than her moving truck. Neighbors later said they knew she would be a problem the moment they saw her walking around with a clipboard on her first day. She had a habit of scanning everyone's property as if she was doing an inspection, even though no one had invited her to do that. Some neighbors even joked that she knew the HOA rulebook better than the people who wrote it. It didn't take her long to notice the planters. One late morning, while the homeowner was trimming a hedge near the driveway, he saw her walking down the street, staring at the planters like they were a crime scene. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just marched straight up to him. "Those things can't stay there," she said immediately, her voice sharp like she had been rehearsing the line all morning. He looked at her calmly. "They're on my property. It doesn't matter," she replied. "They block the view from the street. They disrupt the look of the neighborhood. And they violate HOA rules." He set down his trimming shears and wiped his hands. "I'm not part of the HOA," she blinked, confused. "What do you mean you're not part of the HOA?" "Every house on this road is part of the HOA. Every house except mine," he corrected. "My property line ends before the HOA boundary starts. This land was never added to the association. I've lived here for years, and my deed clearly says so." She didn't like that answer. Her jaw tightened, and she stepped closer to the planters, almost as if she thought she could make them move by staring hard enough. "Well," she finally said, "rules are rules. These planters still affect the neighborhood, and I expect you to remove them. Otherwise, I'll have to take further steps." He turned to face her fully now. "They weigh 4 tons each," he said, his tone steady, but not unkind. "They're staying where they are, and you don't have any authority here." She crossed her arms. "You'll be hearing from the HOA." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, knowing that someone like her would not stop at a simple conversation. She walked away briskly, her steps loud and sharp on the pavement, as if she was trying to prove a point. The next day, he received a letter. It was printed formal-looking, and filled with phrases like community standards and mandatory compliance. It demanded he remove the planters within 7 days, or face a fine. He read it slowly, and then placed it in a drawer with a small sigh. He wrote a short reply, attaching a copy of his property documents and a simple note. "I am not a member of the HOA. This notice does not apply to me."
Right.
For a moment, he hoped that would be the end of it. But the new board member was not someone who gave up easily. 2 days later, another letter arrived. The tone was even more dramatic than the first one, insisting that the planters were a danger, that they disrupted traffic flow. and that the HOA had the right to demand their removal in the interest of the community. Again. He responded, including property boundaries highlighted in color. This time, instead of a letter, showed up at his driveway in the early evening while he was watering his plants. "I don't think you understand how serious this is," she said. "You can't just put things like this wherever you want. You're part of this community, whether you acknowledge it or not." He paused his watering and looked at her quietly. "I told you, this is my land. These planters are my decision. And no rule from your HOA applies here." She pressed her lips together, frustration building like steam under pressure. "I'm giving you one last chance," she said. "Take them away." He shook his head. "They stay." She lifted her chin. "Then you leave me no choice." He didn't know exactly what she meant, but he had a feeling she was about to make things more complicated than they needed to be. As she walked away, he noticed her pulling out her phone immediately, probably calling someone from her HOA group. He could already imagine her saying phrases like non-compliant resident and unsafe structures. Neighbors started noticing her behavior too. A few of them quietly approached him over the next week. One older neighbor shrugged and said, "She's been bothering a lot of people." "You're not the only one she's gone after," another woman whispered. "She thinks she runs everything. Don't take it personally." He didn't take it personally, but he also didn't underestimate her. People who wanted control rarely backed down. Still, he remained calm. The planters stayed. The driveway stayed quiet. And he went on with his days as normally as he could. But she wasn't done. He knew trouble was coming the day he saw her standing across the street with a group of HOA board members, pointing at his driveway like she was giving a guided tour of a forbidden zone. Every few seconds they looked over at him, their faces serious. Some nodded, some frowned, and one wrote something on a clipboard. He watched from a distance, not saying anything. He didn't want to fight, and he didn't want drama. He only wanted space and privacy. But drama had already found him. And as he stood there watching the group huddle in discussion, he had no idea that this would only be the beginning. The planters he had placed for peace would soon become the center of a conflict he never asked for. And the new board member who believed rules applied even where they didn't was already planning her next move. He couldn't predict it yet. But the decision she made after this day would lead to one of the strangest and most unforgettable moments the neighborhood had ever seen. And the planters, silent and unmoving, would become symbols of a battle that wasn't over. The days that followed felt strangely tense. Even though the homeowner tried to keep his routine as normal as always, he watered the plants, checked the mail, and spent time fixing small things around the house. But every now and then, he would notice small signs that the situation with the new HOA board member was far from over. Sometimes he saw her slowly driving by his house, pretending to check something on her phone, but clearly staring at the planters. Other times, he noticed shadows through his curtains and the evening neighbors walking past, pausing for a moment, whispering, then continuing on their way. He wasn't angry, but he could feel something building in the air, like a thunderstorm waiting for the right moment to break. The first direct sign came one morning when he stepped outside to find another HOA letter stuck into the crack of his door. This one was longer than the ones before. It accused him of ignoring community guidelines, damaging the neighborhood's visual cohesion, and being uncooperative with shared standards. It even mentioned possible fines. Even though they had no authority over him at all, he let out a slow breath and took the letter inside. Placing it on the same growing stack of papers in his drawer, he didn't like collecting them, but he knew it was better to keep a record of everything. After the last letter, he was no longer surprised. What did surprise him, though, was how quickly things escalated. The next week, she brought back up. He was clearing leaves near the driveway when he saw her walking toward him with two other HOA board members. All three had a tense look on their faces, like they had prepared a whole speech for him. She spoke first. "We're here to discuss the ongoing violation." He put the rake aside slowly. "There is no violation. I'm not in the HOA." One of the board members cleared his throat. "We understand your position, but this concerns the larger community. These structures," he pointed at the giant planters, "may not meet the aesthetic requirements for residents. They're on my property, the homeowner repeated calmly. And I didn't join your HOA? These planters have nothing to do with your rules. The woman stepped forward. We have had multiple complaints. He knew that wasn't true. A few neighbors had already quietly told him that they didn't have any problem with the planters at all. Some even said they liked how they made the road quieter. But the woman didn't care about that. She wanted control, not agreement. He folded his arms and said, I've warned you already, do not touch them. Her eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. It's not a threat, he said. It's a fact. They weigh for tons. They're not going anywhere. The second board member wrote something down on a clipboard, nodding as if he was taking note of a crime. The whole scene felt strange. 3 adults standing on his driveway, arguing over planters that didn't affect them at all. When they left, he hoped the argument would finally convince them to stop. But deep down, he knew she wasn't going to walk away. In the days that followed, he started seeing things that made him uneasy. A few times, he saw her pointing at his driveway from across the street, while talking to strangers he didn't recognize. One afternoon, a young man in a reflective vest stood near the property line with a measuring tape, looking confused until he spotted the homeowner watching him. The moment their eyes met, the man quickly walked away without explaining why he was there. He couldn't prove anything, but it felt like she was gathering information, trying to find a way to force him into something. One evening, as he sat on his porch enjoying the quiet air, an older neighbor walked over and sat beside him. She's stirring too much trouble, the neighbor said softly. She's been calling people, talking big at meetings, saying she's going to fix the whole neighborhood. He didn't reply for a moment. He simply stared at the trees near the road, watching their branches sway gently. I don't want to fight anyone, he finally said. I know, the neighbor replied, but she thinks she can run everything. Be careful. She doesn't like being told no. After the neighbor left, the homeowner sat in silence for a long time, thinking things through. He wasn't afraid, but he didn't like unnecessary conflict. Still, he couldn't allow someone to claim power over land that wasn't theirs. The planters were his decision, his property, his right. The situation took another turn when he received a letter not from the HOA this time, but from a landscaping company. It was an estimate for removing 2 large concrete structures from his driveway. He stared at the paper, confused. He hadn't contacted any landscaping crew. He walked outside, half expecting to see equipment or workers nearby. But everything was quiet. He went back inside and looked at the paper again. At the bottom, it said the request came from someone claiming to represent the community board. He rubbed his forehead slowly. She had gone further than he expected. The next morning, as he was drinking coffee by the window, he saw her walking by again. But this time, there was something different in her step. She didn't look annoyed or impatient. She looked confident, almost triumphant, like she had solved some puzzle. He knew then she wasn't giving up. Later that same day, he got a call from an unknown number. When he answered, a man with a professional voice said they were confirming the upcoming removal appointment. What removal? The homeowner asked. The removal of the concrete barriers, the man replied. Scheduled for the end of next week. He closed his eyes briefly and took a quiet breath. I didn't request that service, he said calmly. Cancel it, the man hesitated. We were told by a board representative. Cancel it, he repeated, his voice firm. After hanging up, he stared out the window at the planters. They sat silently, heavy and unmoving, as steady as mountains. He knew she was trying to get rid of them without his permission. She must have thought if she hired a crew and made it look official enough, he wouldn't question it, but she didn't understand him at all. Later that week, while he was checking the garden beds, he heard arguing near the mailbox. 2 neighbors were talking in sharp whispers. She can't do that, one said. He's not even part of the HOA. Try telling her that, the other replied. She thinks she has the right to run the entire street. Pretended not to hear them, but their words confirmed what he already suspected. She was telling everyone she had authority. She was telling the board she was fixing a problem. She was telling neighbors she was protecting the neighborhood. But what she really wanted was control. The final moment that told him things were headed somewhere dangerous came one Saturday morning. He stepped outside and saw a printed notice taped to one of the planters. It said, scheduled for removal, Do not obstruct. The paper was signed only with the initials of the HOA board. He peeled it off slowly, shook his head. She wasn't backing down. She was building up. He walked back inside, placed the notice next to the other letters, and took a deep breath. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want anyone to get into a fight. But he also wasn't going to allow someone to invade his rights that evening. He stood in his driveway, looking at the massive planters that had started all this trouble. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was quiet, but there was a strange tension in it. It's like everything was waiting for something to happen. He knew she was planning something bigger now. Something she thought would finally force him to bend. She believed she was in the right. She believed she had the power, but she didn't understand the weight of what she was messing with. The planters were more than just concrete. They were proof strong. Unmoving proof that some things couldn't be pushed over by authority. She didn't actually have. The homeowner didn't know exactly what she would try next. But he had a feeling it would be bold. Maybe even dramatic in whatever she was planning. She didn't seem to realize one thing. She was about to go too far. And the day she crossed that line would be the day everything changed, not just for her, but for the whole neighborhood. The morning everything changed started like any other. The homeowner woke up early, made himself a simple breakfast, stepped outside with his cup of coffee to enjoy the quiet air. The sun was just beginning to rise, spreading soft colors across the sky. It was peaceful, calm, exactly the kind of morning he loved. But that peace didn't last long. As he stood near the porch, he heard a low rumble in the distance. At first, he thought it was a garbage truck or a construction vehicle passing through the neighborhood. But the sound grew louder, too loud, too close, and too heavy to be just a normal passing truck. He turned toward the road and saw a large flatbed truck slowly making its way down the street. Behind it was a smaller pickup, followed by a landscaping vehicle with equipment strapped to the back. The homeowner froze for a moment, confusion mixing with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Then he noticed her, the HOA board. Member was walking behind the vehicles with a clipboard in her hand and a self-satisfied look on her face. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't pretending. She was leading the whole thing. The trucks pulled up right in front of his driveway. Workers in bright safety vests jumped out, stretching their arms as if they had a long day ahead of them. One of them pointed to the giant planters. "We're here for those," the man said. The homeowner set down his cup slowly. "You're here to do what?" "Remove the concrete blocks," the worker replied casually. "We were hired for the job. Should take a few hours." The board member stepped forward, smiling like she had just solved a neighborhood mystery. "You refuse to cooperate," she said. "So the board approved action to fix this issue." He looked at her, calm but stern. "You have no authority here. This is my property." She lifted her chin proudly. "I've already handled everything with the company. They know why they're here." The worker nodded. "We were told these are community hazards." "They aren't," the homeowner said firmly. "And you're trespassing." The workers looked at each other, suddenly unsure. They weren't expecting resistance. They especially weren't expecting a conflict. Their faces shifted from confidence to hesitation. "Look," the lead worker said, "we're just doing our job. If there's a mistake, talk to the board. We just need to get these removed." The homeowner stepped forward, his voice steady. "I never ordered this service. I never approved it. And those planters weigh for tons each. If you try to move them, you'll damage your equipment and you'll be breaking the law by touching property that isn't yours." The man hesitated, glancing at the board member. "Ma'am, is he right about the ownership?" "Of course not," she snapped. "He's trying to intimidate you. Do your job." But the workers were no longer convinced. One of them knelt to inspect the planters and let out a low whistle. "These are massive," he said. "We didn't bring the right machine for something this heavy. We'd need a bigger loader, maybe even a crane." "You don't need anything else," she insisted. "Just get them out of the way." The lead worker shook his head. "Ma'am, that's not how this works. We can't just drag something that weighs thousands of pounds. And we can't touch private property without the owner's consent. This is a liability issue." She stepped closer to the workers, pointing at the planters angrily. "I am giving you permission. I represent the HOA. Homeowner stayed calm. They don't answer to you. And again, this land is not part of your HOA. I've told you that multiple times. The workers exchanged looks again. One of them whispered, "We're not getting paid enough for this." The board member turned red with frustration. "Fine," she snapped. "If you won't do it, I'll get someone else. But this is happening today." She stormed toward her car and made a call, pacing back and forth angrily as she spoke loudly into the phone. Meanwhile, the workers stepped aside and approached the homeowner quietly. "Sir," the lead worker said, "we don't want any trouble. We had no idea this was a private issue. If you want, we can pack up and leave." "Please do," the homeowner replied kindly. "I know you're just doing your job." The workers nodded with relief. They began reloading their equipment, clearly eager to get away from the situation. But the moment they started packing up, the HOA board member ended her call and rushed over. "What are you doing?" She shouted. "Stop packing. You're supposed to remove those." "We're leaving," the lead worker said. "We're not allowed to touch them." She threw her hands in the air. "This is unbelievable. I gave you instructions." "And we're telling you," the worker said, keeping his voice professional, "that we can't do this legally. If the owner objects, we have to step back." Her voice grew louder, sharper. "You can't just leave." But they did. The workers climbed into their trucks, the engines roaring back to life. The vehicles turned around one by one and drove back down the street, leaving the woman standing in the middle of the road, stunned and furious. For a moment, the street went quiet. Then she spun around to face the homeowner. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You think this is over? You can't block community access with these things. I'll make sure they're removed." He didn't raise his voice. "You've gone too far already." She marched away without responding, her footsteps heavy and fast. He watched her disappear around the corner, knowing she wasn't done. But he also knew this would only make things worse for her. A few hours later, he received another letter. This one wasn't a warning, it was a threat. She claimed he was obstructing neighborhood improvements and interfering with official work. Even added that the HOA would take legal measures if he didn't. "Remove the planters immediately." He sat on his couch, holding the letter, shaking his head. She was completely out of control. There was no reasoning with someone who believed they had unlimited authority. But what she didn't know was that she had crossed a line. And the more she pushed, the more she exposed herself. That evening, as the sun was setting, a couple of neighbors walked over to him. One of them shook his head with disbelief. "Did she really bring a whole crew to remove those?" he asked. "Yes," the homeowner replied. "She's lost it," the other neighbor muttered. "She keeps saying she's fixing the neighborhood, but she's causing chaos." They talked for a while, sharing stories about how she had tried to enforce rules that didn't exist. The homeowner listened, but he didn't complain. He simply nodded, appreciating their concern. When the neighbors left, he walked down to the planters. He placed his hand on the rough concrete surface, feeling the solid, unmoving weight beneath it. They weren't going anywhere, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But the real problem wasn't the planters. It was the growing obsession she had. The homeowner didn't know what she would try next, but he had a feeling it would be even bigger than what she had done today. She was getting desperate. And desperate people made reckless decisions. He stood there for a long time, watching the road where the trucks had come and gone. The air was still, but there was a tension beneath it that he couldn't ignore. Something else was coming. Something she believed would finally give her the power she wanted. And when that moment arrived, it would change everything. The planters had become more than barriers. They were now symbols of a fight she couldn't win. And the next move she made would be the one she regretted the most. The next morning arrived quietly. But the homeowner could feel something heavy lingering in the air. It wasn't the weight of the planters or the stress of the last few days. It was the feeling that something was about to happen. Something bigger than hired landscapers and angry letters. Something that would finally bring this ongoing tension to a breaking point. He did his best to stay calm. He brewed his coffee, fed the birds near the garden, and took a slow walk around his property. He checked the plants, the fence, the mailbox, normal things he did every day. But every time he turned toward the road, he found himself watching for movement. By mid-morning, that movement finally appeared. He was inside the kitchen when he heard the unmistakable sound of cars stopping outside. These weren't big trucks like yesterday. These were smaller, official-sounding, in rhythm, and heavy enough that he instantly knew something was different. He stepped outside, and there they were, 2 deputy vehicles parked along the road. Their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. The doors opened, and 3 county deputies stepped out, calm, professional, and already looking around with the trained eyes of people used to handling disputes. And right beside them stood the HOA board member. She looked proud, almost triumphant, holding a folder under her arm as if it were a trophy. The moment she spotted the homeowner, she lifted her chin like she had finally found the upper hand she had been reaching for. "There he is," she said to the deputies, pointing directly at him. "That's the one who refused to cooperate and threatened workers yesterday." He blinked, surprised. "Threatened," he repeated quietly. One of the deputies raised a hand gently. "Sir, we're here to talk. Just want to understand the situation." The board member immediately jumped in. He blocked the workers. He yelled at them. He told them they couldn't touch the planters, even though they were creating a hazard. "He's obstructing community safety measures." The deputies exchanged a glance, clearly used to dealing with one-sided stories. The homeowner didn't panic. Instead, he simply replied, "None of what she said is true. And these planters are on my property. I am not part of her HOA." One deputy stepped closer, his voice calm and neutral. "We got a report that there was a disagreement involving hired workers. Were you aware they were coming to remove these large concrete structures?" "Yes," the homeowner said. "They were hired without my consent. And the workers themselves stopped the job because they realized they were trespassing." The deputy nodded thoughtfully. "Do you mind if we take a look at the property lines?" "Not at all," the homeowner said. "I have everything inside. I can show you." The board member suddenly stiffened. "There's no need for that," she snapped. "Everyone knows the association covers this area." The deputy turned to her with a polite but firm expression. "Ma'am, we still need to verify. We can't make assumptions without documentation." She huffed loudly, clearly frustrated that the deputies weren't blindly agreeing with her. But the homeowner didn't pay attention to her mood. Instead, he went inside, retrieved his property papers, and brought them out. The deputies reviewed everything slowly, carefully. They checked the diagrams, matched the numbers, and even walked the boundary line with him to confirm. After several minutes, one of the deputies turned to the board member. "Ma'am," he said gently, "it appears his property is indeed outside your HOA's jurisdiction." She stared at him, eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That can't be right," she insisted. "Everyone on this road is part of the community." Another deputy chimed in, voice steady. "Not in this case. The documents are clear. His land wasn't included when the association was formed," the homeowner added. "I told her this many times. She didn't believe me." The board member began to panic, not with fear, but with indignation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He's affecting the look of the neighborhood. He's blocking the view. It's a safety concern." The deputies glanced at the planters. Local regulations didn't forbid them. They weren't blocking the sidewalk. They weren't endangering traffic. They were simply big and heavy but perfectly legal, ma'am. One deputy said calmly, "These planters aren't violating any laws." She looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her feet. "So you're not going to do anything?" The deputy remained polite but firm. "We cannot force someone to remove something from their own property if it's legal." "But he threatened the workers," she cried out. The deputy shook his head. "We talked to the landscaping company this morning. They confirmed he did not threaten anyone. They chose to leave because they didn't have permission to be here." The board member froze. Her plan had fallen apart. Not only had she dragged deputies to a private property dispute, but her claim was now proven false. The workers backed the homeowner. The paperwork backed the homeowner. The law backed him completely. She swallowed hard, her voice shaky with anger. "So what happens now?" she demanded. The deputy straightened respectfully. "We're filing a report. Since you arranged for workers to enter land that isn't part of your association, there may be liability concerns. The county may contact you about trespassing issues. For now, please do not step onto his property again." Her face turned pale. The homeowner stayed quiet, not wanting to embarrass her further. But the deputies weren't done. "Ma'am," another deputy said, "we also recommend you stop sending notices to an address outside your jurisdiction. Continuing could be considered harassment." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The deputies turned to the homeowner. "Sir, if she or anyone from the HOA continues to enter your property without permission, call us directly. We'll handle it." He nodded calmly. "Thank you." The deputies returned to their vehicles, finished their notes, and drove away. When their cars disappeared, the street grew quiet again, almost too quiet. The board member stood still in the middle of the road, defeated but refusing to leave. She stared at the planters as if they had personally insulted her. Finally, she muttered, "This isn't over." But even she didn't sound convinced. She walked away slowly. Not with her usual commanding steps, but with small, stiff movements of someone who had been hit with a painful truth. The homeowner stood near the planters for a long moment after she disappeared. Not out of pride, not out of triumph, just relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like the situation had reached a point where the truth was finally clear to everyone. Not just him. But the story didn't end with her walking away. Later that day, several neighbors stopped by or waved from across the street. Word spread fast in neighborhoods, especially when something dramatic happened. A man walking his dog paused and said, "I saw the deputies. Hope everything's okay?" "It's fine now," the homeowner said. Another neighbor leaned over his fence. "She's been giving everyone a hard time. Maybe this will finally calm her down." The homeowner didn't respond. He didn't know if she would calm down. Someone with that much determination rarely surrendered completely. But she had been warned. Not by him, but by the county. That night, after everyone settled back into their homes and the sun faded into the horizon, the homeowner sat on his porch and looked at the two massive planters at the end of his driveway. They stood solid and unmoving, exactly as they always had. He thought back to the moment he placed them, just wanting peace and privacy. He never expected they would become symbols of a struggle, or that he would need to defend them with property documents and sheriff visits. But now they stood for something more. They were proof that he had done nothing wrong. They were proof that she had overstepped. And although he didn't know what she would do next or if this truly was the end, he did know one thing for certain. The planters weren't going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And the next steps she took would decide whether this ended quietly or turned into something even bigger. But for now, the road was calm, and the homeowner finally felt like the truth had begun to win. The days after the confrontation moved slower, almost as if the entire neighborhood was quietly processing what had happened. For the homeowner, life felt lighter. There was no more guessing about what would happen next, no more surprise letters slipped into his mailbox, and no more unannounced visitors trying to tell him what to do with his own land. But even if things had calmed down on the outside, the inside of the neighborhood was buzzing with quiet conversations. People who had barely spoken to him before now gave him nods from their porches. Some even stopped during their morning walks to ask how he was holding up. Most didn't bring up the trouble directly, but the look in their eyes said they already knew the whole story. Word spread fast on that street, but for once, the story wasn't weighed down by drama. It felt like people were simply relieved that someone had finally drawn a line and held it. The homeowner kept his days normal. He worked on small repairs around his property, checked on the planters, and tried to bring his routine back to its old shape. The planters looked exactly the same as before, standing like two huge, quiet guards at the entrance of the driveway. He wiped some dust off them one morning and stepped back. Even though they hadn't moved an inch during the whole ordeal, they now carried a different meaning. They weren't just barriers anymore. They had become part of the story. The neighbors continued to whisper about the HOA board's emergency meeting the night after the deputies left. He didn't attend, of course, since his home didn't fall under their control. But he heard from someone across the street that the meeting was tense. People wanted answers. Some wanted accountability. Others wanted peace. A few were simply embarrassed that things had gotten so far. At the center of all this was the woman who had pushed the entire situation to its breaking point. She wasn't seen outside much anymore. No more slow walking past his driveway. No more taking pictures of everyone's porch or lawn. No more standing by the mailbox waiting for someone to ask her a question. It was as if she had taken a step back from the role she created for herself. But the homeowner didn't feel proud or victorious. He just felt quiet. He had never wanted to embarrass anyone or win anything. He only wanted people to leave his property alone and respect simple boundaries. The whole thing had felt like a strange battle he never asked for. One morning, as he stood near the planters, a neighbor walked over, someone older, gentle, and never involved in any sort of dispute. This neighbor leaned on his walking stick and looked at the planters for a long moment before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "those things might outlive all of us." The homeowner laughed quietly. "That's the plan," he replied. The older man nodded and smiled. "Well, they're a reminder now. Not just for her, for the whole street." The homeowner knew exactly what he meant. The planters had become symbols of something much bigger than concrete. They were a reminder of boundaries, respect, and the simple truth that people can't claim control where they have none. But they were also a reminder of how quickly small misunderstandings can grow when pride and power get mixed together. Days turned into a week. Then, too, a quiet shift happened at the HOA. The woman who caused so many problems was no longer on the board. She stepped down, or maybe she was encouraged to. No one said the full story out loud. The silence spoke clearly. Other board members began showing a friendlier face to the neighborhood. They stopped sending out tense letters. They waved more. They held shorter meetings. It seemed like everyone wanted to reset the energy of the community. The homeowner didn't hold any grudges. He didn't even feel angry anymore. If anything, he felt relieved that the situation might finally be over. He watered his garden, cleaned his porch, and tried to enjoy his evenings the way he used to before the trouble started. But something else happened, too. Something he didn't expect. One afternoon, he found himself standing near the planters again, and he realized he wasn't just relieved. He was grateful. Not for the trouble, of course, but for the people who had quietly stood by him. The neighbors who nodded. The ones who checked in. The ones who told him they understood. Even the deputies who handled everything calmly and professionally. It made him feel like he wasn't alone in this neighborhood after all. A few days later, he decided to make some changes around the planters. Not to hide them, not to soften them, but to make them part of something nicer. He added a little stonework around the base of each one. A simple design, nothing fancy. Then he placed ground lights near them so they glowed softly at night. When the sun went down and the lights came on, the planters didn't look like obstacles anymore. They looked like part of the landscape, strong, grounded, quietly beautiful. That's when the nickname started. He didn't come up with it. Someone else did. One evening, as he was putting away some tools, a neighbor called out from across the street, "Nice touch on the monuments." He squinted, confused. "The what?" The neighbor laughed. "The monuments. You know her monuments?" And just like that, the name spread. The monuments became what everyone called the two planters. Not in a mean way, not to mock anyone, but in a light-hearted, almost playful tone. It was the neighborhood's inside joke. A gentle reminder that sometimes the things people try to control end up controlling nothing but their own embarrassment. He didn't argue with the name. He actually liked it. Every time someone mentioned the monuments, it felt like they were saying, "We remember what happened here, and we're choosing the peaceful version of that story." One evening, long after the drama had settled, he sat outside on his porch with a cup of tea. The lights around the planters glowed warmly in the dark. Fireflies blinked in the yard. The air was soft and still. He thought back on everything that had happened, the warnings he gave, The letters he received, the machinery that failed, the deputies' calm voices, the embarrassment on the faces of the board members, the way the neighborhood had quietly changed. It was strange how something so stressful could lead to a moment so peaceful. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt settled. Like everything had fallen into the exact place it needed to be. The planters weren't going anywhere. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Maybe not even for decades. They weighed too much to move, but that wasn't the real reason they would stay. They would stay because they had become part of the story of the street, a story the neighbors would remember, a story the HOA would think twice about before repeating, a story the woman who tried to force her power would never forget, and most importantly, a story the homeowner could finally close with a deep breath and a quiet smile. The street was peaceful again, and the planters stood strong, silent reminders of what happens when someone ignores a simple warning and tries to claim control where they never had any. They weren't just barriers, they were lessons, permanent ones.